Okay, I'm on.
Hey, Alderman.
Hey, Alderman, welcome. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kevin Bargnus. I'm with the Communications Division of the Department of Planning and Development. I'm going to be here behind the scenes this evening, making sure things run smoothly. Just to be advised, the meeting is being recorded and we're live streaming it to the department's YouTube page for later viewing. With that, I will turn it over to Cindy Rubik to get us rolling. Cindy?
Thanks, Kevin. Cindy Rubik. I'm an assistant commissioner with the Department of Planning and Development. I lead the Central Planning Region. For tonight's meeting, we had about just over 300 registrants, and it is a Zoom webinar format. So we'll go through the presentation. We have both Metra as well as Department of Transportation folks on the call. We'll go through the presentation. We'll have Alderman Burnett welcome everyone as well. And then we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have questions, please enter them in the Zoom Q&A box and we'll answer them both written as well as verbally during the Q&A at the end of the presentations. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. And again, we'll be here to answer your questions. Alderman?
Thank you very much, Cindy, and everyone else on the panel. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alderman Burnett. This is an opportunity to see what Metra and the city is looking at in reference to having more convenient transportation in this area. A lot of folks have been looking for a means of metro transportation close to this area. It's been sought after by many people and many organizations. So they did a study, and so now they're getting ready to tell you what they're looking at and also what the timelines are. So with that, we're going to allow them to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman. I'm going to transfer it now to Jeff Schreiber from the Department of Transportation.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Schreiber. I'm the Director of Transportation Planning and Programming at the City of Chicago's Department of Transportation. And first want to say thank you to everybody for attending this evening. We have more than 100 participants so far, so I really appreciate everyone taking their time and their interest, and we'll look forward to answering questions, and hopefully the presentation itself will answer a lot of questions, and then we can follow up with clarifications as needed after that. Next slide, please. So first off, I assume many, if not most people on the call have been to public meetings online already. Basically, the recording for the meeting will be available on DPD's webpage, which is shown in number 2 below. You can use the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can hold your cursor over it and then click on Q&A to answer the questions. So please feel free to use that function, and then we'll respond verbally or in writing by the panelists after the presentation is concluded. Next slide, please. So this evening, we'd like to hit on a few key points related to the proposed Kinsey-Fulton Market area new metro station. But we'll first start off with a overview of Metra's A2 interlocking project. And this is a kind of a foundational element to improving the tracks in this area, and then the station would be closely related to that. So then we'll talk about the station after we've learned about A2. And then we'll get into a brief overview of potential timeline and next steps. And then we'll take the questions. Next slide, please. So with that, I will hand it over to David Kralik at Metra to begin sharing with us more about Metra's A2 project.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, I'm David Kralik, Department Head for Long Range Planning at Metra. And before we talk about the station feasibility study tonight, I'd like to give you an overview of the challenges at the existing A2 crossing and our proposals to improve it. A2 is the railroad name that's given to the crossing where the UP West tracks cross the Milwaukee District North and West lines and the North Central Service tracks, right around and on top of the bridge over Western Avenue. Now, the map on this slide shows those lines, and the photo at the bottom corner is a view of the crossing looking west. So in addition to the 4 Metra lines that operate through A2 and revenue service, trains from 3 additional Metra lines cross through A2 to get to the maintenance facilities just west of the crossing that are also highlighted on the map. In addition, there's 16 Amtrak trains to and from Milwaukee and Seattle that pass through here each day. So there's really a lot of activity going on. Next slide. Now, unfortunately, all those trains passing through A2 have to take turns going through the crossing. So it's a bit like having a 4-way stop sign in the middle of an expressway. Trains have to slow or stop near A2, which is built using switch equipment from the early part of the 20th century. And nearly half of Metra riders rely on trains that pass through this interlocking. If it goes down at the wrong time, it can cripple Metra service. It's also particularly challenging to maintain in inclement weather, which adds reliability challenges. So as you might guess, we have some plans to try to improve this crossing and really remove this bottleneck. Next slide. So to maintain service reliability for the 200 trains on 7 of Metra's 11 rail lines and allow for potential future service expansion, Metra is proposing improvements to this area. This is necessary to create the capacity to stop trains at a new station within the area. Currently, there's not enough track capacity to add a station in this area. So a flyover must be built before or at the same time as a new station in order to facilitate station construction. Next slide. At this point, Metra's completed conceptual design for a flyover at this location. Now, a flyover is just a bridge that takes one set of tracks over another. The image on the right shows Metra's most recently completed flyover in the region down in Englewood. We're currently completing early value engineering work along with operations modeling to help us find the most cost-effective solution for this project. 2 alternatives that are still under consideration are shown on this slide. They would take the UP tracks up and over the Milwaukee District tracks, either just east or just west of Ashland Avenue. The next steps will be to move this project into full design and begin environmental analysis, where additional public involvement would be undertaken. Next slide. While Metra has been exploring solutions at A2, the city of Chicago approached us regarding a potential new infill station to serve the Kinsey-Fulton Market area. An infill station is one where Metra trains already operate but do not stop. As we've done for similar requests from other communities, we asked CDOT to hire a consultant to come to complete a station feasibility study to evaluate the merits of such a proposal. We want to make sure that the analysis is data-driven and quantifiable, that it weighs the benefits to new riders against impacts to existing riders, and that it conforms to all of our standards regarding design, safety, and accessibility. CDOT agreed to initiate such a study with Metra as a key stakeholder. And so at this point, I'll turn it back over to Jeff to walk through the results of the station feasibility analysis.
Thank you, David. So today or this evening, we'd like to explain what we've learned so far. I think this is an ongoing process. So it's not to say that this analysis is complete, but we've kind of reached some preliminary conclusions and wanted to make sure that we started the public outreach, which will be ongoing for many years, undoubtedly related to this, but just based upon what we know so far. So that's what we'll be sharing tonight. So kind of starting with the kind of stepping back, the large sort of regional view. You can see in the middle of this image, in the red dot there, or oval with yellow border, represents this area of the A2 project, where all of these Metra lines, the Metra Milwaukee District North, Milwaukee District West, UP West, and the North Central Service all kind of come together and then share a corridor coming into downtown from the west for about the last couple miles of the train journey. These train lines stretch out to the west side of Chicago, the northwest side of Chicago, and the northwest and west suburbs. And so having the ability to get on or off a train a few miles west of where the trains terminate in the loop could provide both the ability for people coming from the west and northwest sides of the city, as well as suburban areas, to access the growing number of jobs in this area, but also provide the ability for people who live in this area and actually throughout the city via other transferring transit connections to use these transit lines to get to jobs and other destinations further to the west and northwest too. So sometimes that's called the traditional commute going downtown, or the reverse commute coming out from downtown towards the suburbs. Next slide, please. So this is a bit sort of zoomed in image showing just the parts here in the city. So the star kind of represents the area that we're talking about on the near west side along these Metra lines. And you can see how the Metra UP West line goes sort of straight west from there. And then the Milwaukee District and north and north and west and north central service lines kind of radiate out to the north and west from there, serving a variety of city neighborhoods. One thing you can also see on this map is that this part of the city is largely kind of in between CTA's radial rapid transit system. So obviously a lot of the city of Chicago is covered by rail service by the CTA, but then this part of the northwest side, or sort of wedge of the northwest side, is actually pretty far from the nearest CTA stop. So the ability to sort of increase the utility of these lines has definitely has a benefit for city residents, as well as obvious suburban customers of Metra. Next slide, please. So kind of going back to what David was saying about Metra's framework for evaluating potential new stations, the city took a look at a travel market assessment to try to understand the nature of travel demand in this corridor where all these lines come together, and where we would contemplate or are contemplating potentially putting a new station in the future. And there were essentially what came out of that was about four general site areas that seemed to be good have good prospects to be a station, primarily because they were along the kind of the major cross streets that cross the tracks in this area. So Damon on the west, Ashland towards the middle of the corridor, and Ogden going towards the east, and then Racine Avenue at the far east of the corridor. So those were the general area. This is the general area that we have studied. Next, please. This illustration shows in a little bit more detail the near west side of the city of Chicago, and the sort of job clusters, growing job clusters in this area, represented in the yellow shading from the Fulton Market Innovation District, kind of in that area to the east of Ashland Avenue, to the long established and still growing Kinsey Industrial Corridor to the west of Ashland. And then the Illinois Medical District, about a mile to the south of this corridor. And then up towards the north and the northeast area, you can see the North Branch Industrial Corridor, which is a little bit further away, but could potentially be served by a station here via transfer connections to other, say, bus transit lines. And also, I'm sorry, that last image there shows, this image does too, shows the relationship of this Metra corridor to the green line, which is just a few blocks to the south, and the pink line, which shares some tracks with the green line, and before branching off just west of Ashland Avenue. So one of the types of analysis we did was looking at the existing jobs as well as the job trends that would be located within a quarter-mile walk of each of these potential locations. So as you can see, that the jobs currently are very concentrated towards the eastern end of the corridor, with 24,000 jobs within walking distance of the Racine and Ashland, Racine and Ogden areas. Nearly 20,000 jobs concentrated or within walking distance of Ashland, and then about 5,000 jobs within walking distance of Damon. Still respectable, but not as much as there are towards the east. Next slide, please. Another factor that we took into account in trying to establish some baseline data here was looking at transit boardings within the areas around these different potential station areas. And so this shows both within 1/8 of a mile and within 1/4 of a mile how many existing CTA rail and bus boardings occur near these stations, to get a general idea of the amount of transit activity going on here now. And that shows that the transit activity in this area currently is very much concentrated along Ashland. Obviously, Ashland Avenue is a major bus corridor, stretches nearly the length of the entire city, and is one of CTA's busiest and most popular bus corridors, with both the number 9 local bus as well as an X9 limited stop service that runs along that route. So next we looked at some unique characteristics of one of the stationaries in particular. You recall that we had talked about how the Racine Avenue stop was closest to where the job concentration is right now. But Racine has some characteristics that are a bit different from the other 3 potential station sites. One characteristic is that one of the Metra services that runs along this corridor, the UP West Line, actually branches off from the other 3 and is located about a block and a half north of the other 3 Metra services by the time you get to Racine Avenue. And the other major characteristic is that those other 3, the Milwaukee District West, Milwaukee District North, and North Central service, run on tracks that at Racine Avenue are at grade. So they're no longer up above the street level on a viaduct structure, but running right at grade and cross each of those streets there at grade. And what this means from an operational perspective is that if we were to put a station at grade at Racine Avenue, whenever the trains come in and stop, for safety reasons, the next 3 streets down the line, Racine, May, and Aberdeen, would have to have the gates down to allow the train to then leave the station safely and continue on its way eastbound. Also, there would be delays as the train is slowing down westbound to approach the station. So obviously right now, all of the trains that come through here do cause the gates to go down. But what we found is that on our what we call the baseline here, in the morning, the gates are down for about 30 minutes out of the peak 2 hours in the morning. So that's a quarter of the time the gates are down, which is actually quite considerable. And it does have traffic and circulation impacts in this area. But if we were to put a station here, that gate down time would increase to 69 minutes out of the peak 2 hours in the morning. So that's more than half the time the gates would be down. And that's really, I think you can probably tell where this is going. That's really pretty unacceptable. And there's really not any way around it other than saying elevating the tracks or something, but that also really can't physically be done. We thought about that for a little bit, but that would be very, very complicated given the other constraints and just the geometry and how fast a train could go up or down. And so it's basically this is a fatal flaw for the Racine location, that it would just create too many negative impacts on the area with these gates being down all the time. Even in the PM, when the trains are going westbound, the gates down would increase from nearly a quarter of the time today to more than a third of the time with a station. Next slide, please. So with that sort of baseline background information, we came up with a screening methodology looking at these 5 characteristics: travel market, multimodal network impacts, rail operations impacts, land use and development considerations, leading kind of into the travel market, and then implementation considerations. And that's basically like the constructability of the station. And we screened the different locations with those criteria. And again, this is to understand feasibility. So mostly the technical feasibility, like really, is it possible to put a station here? And should we be doing more study here, or is this just not going to work at all technically, and it's not worth even thinking about anymore? So next slide, please. And what we came to find out through this feasibility screening process is that the Racine, as we saw, was fatally flawed. So we're kind of took the analysis took that out of consideration. Damon could be feasible, but it didn't really score as highly on a lot of these characteristics as the Ashland and Ogden did. We looked at both sort of west side of Ashland and east side of Ashland, as well as Ogden, and those kind of three locations really came to the top of the analysis, and you can see here having the highest favorability in a lot of different categories that we looked at. The next slide, please. So then, as based upon that analysis, we looked at the physical configurations of on the site, or the physical characteristics of the site, and started to get a general sense of how might a station best leverage the fact that Ashland and Ogden are both desirable places to have station entrances. And those Ashland and Ogden here at the railroad tracks are about 1,750 feet or so apart from one another. And the platform, a train platform itself, would be about 900 feet long. So a little over half of that distance in between it. So the kind of the working concept that we have now going into this, based upon this analysis of feasibility, is that what we'd like to study further is essentially creating a station that would have platforms that would span most of the distance between Ogden and Ashland, and then be able to walk from those platforms over down to Ashland on the west, both the east and west sides of Ashland, because there's buses that run on both sides of the street, and there's demand on both sides of the street, and it's a busy street too. And then another walkway that would lead people over to Ogden Avenue, and allow people to then walk from there to the points east. Next slide, please. So this schematic illustration we created to again represent schematically what how a station in this area could function. Obviously, this would be subject to much more analysis in the years ahead, but just to give it sort of a general sense of how circulation might be able to work around a station in this area. So the kind of dark dashed blue line represents what could be essentially a pedestrian circulation concourse underneath the tracks that would be rebuilt as part of the A2 project that Metra described earlier. Then create a sort of an open concourse underneath it for circulation that would run all the way from Ashland on the west to Ogden on the east. The red dashed lines would represent various intermediate points along this corridor that would have stairs and escalators and or elevators that would go up to the platform level from this concourse area and connect these areas to the adjacent streets and sidewalks. from these red areas would kind of be the entry points into the station. The blue lines represent streets that would have circulation for vehicles as well as for pedestrians on the sidewalks and bike access too. And then the pink dashed lines would represent what we, again, conceptually, we're thinking could be more pedestrian circulation corridors, especially in some of these narrow areas that wouldn't lend themselves very well to street the circulation, but could be enhanced for enhanced pedestrian circulation. And you can see on here, kind of heading east from the Ogden entrance to the station, there could be a pedestrian corridor that would go along the old Kinsey Street corridor, lead to points in between the two sets of railroad tracks further east, or lead potentially to connections via the side streets to the areas to the north and south of the railroad tracks. And then over on the west side on Ashland, there would be entrances to the station on both sides of Ashland, primarily to serve people walking along Ashland, as well as the CTA buses that are run along Ashland very frequently. And then the other sort of pickup and drop off at the station is envisioned in this schematic diagram as occurring primarily on the south. And the idea would be to extend Arbor Place that right now starts at Ashland and then goes east to Justine and then to Laughlin, but it does not extend all the way to Ogden. And it did 100 and some years ago before the trains and a lot of these other buildings were built. Harbor did extend, and so this would basically be re-extending that to form kind of a southern long corridor all along the station that could be a sort of continuous sidewalk and pickup and drop off zone for whether it's for vehicles, cabs, Ubers, Lyfts, shuttle buses, or other pickup and drop off. And pedestrian and bike access would be provided all along this area as well. So kind of the pickup and drop off area, though mostly concentrated to the south to take advantage of the robust street grid network and the easy access to the other main streets in this area. The street grid is not as continuous to the north, which is why this concept would suggest that concentrating that sort of access to the south would be the better option there. And definitely subject to a lot more study, but this is kind of the concept to get the discussion started. Next slide, please. So with that kind of overview, next we want to give a brief talk just briefly about a potential timeline for doing a project like this. Now, this would be a very, very large undertaking, both that A2 track project from Metra, as well as adding a new station into this area. Because of the number of tracks that are involved, the number of trains that come through here, the type of infrastructure that would be required to support all of this. This is not your sort of garden variety new Metra station out in the suburbs, which is, not to diminish the importance of those stations, but can be done, in a relative sense a lot with relatively less effort. It's usually in the suburban cases, it's just putting some platforms at grade on the ground next to the tracks. But here, this is all elevated up and the tracks need to move around. So it's a lot more complicated. It's in the middle of a densely built up area, and there will need to be a lot of community and public consultation as part of the process of figuring out exactly where the station needs to be, what all the details ought to be, how to respect the interests of the properties that are around here, and the ability to improve the area and to support the future development and future needs of the city and the region. So this is going to take quite a bit of time, as you can see on here. A project like this would also necessarily require federal funding to, at least in part. And when projects require federal funding, they need to follow the rules and regulations of the National Environmental Protection Act, which is abbreviated here as NEPA. So that spells out a process for public consultation and understanding the impacts of projects, both the impacts to natural environment as well as the human environment. Obviously, in a station area like this, the human environment impacts would most likely be more significant than that. The natural impacts, there's not sort of parks or natural areas right in this area. So it's mostly the NEPA process and the environmental review process would focus on what are the community impacts, what are the traffic impacts, what are the potential development impacts, and those sort of things like that would all be discussed and worked out through the environmental review process. And to the extent that impacts are identified, then strategies would be developed to mitigate the impacts and to address the impacts as part of the project. So what we anticipate here is that it would take at least 2 or 3 more years to get through all of that environmental review and preliminary engineering, 30% design, as it's called on here, and then another year plus to get through the final design after the general station for a general plan for the station is determined and a consensus is reached on kind of exactly where it should be and how it should function and what it should look like. We still need to prepare all the final plans, which should take more time. And then the construction would extend over several years beyond that into the latter part of this decade and into the next decade. And again, this sort of schedule assumes that sort of all the funding is lined up and there when is needed, which is pretty rarely the case. So I'd say this represents about the most aggressive kind of a schedule for implementation that we could contemplate. So I'd say high likelihood that it would not happen this quickly, but if all the stars lined up, this is could be possible. Next slide, please. And when we spoke about how much funding would have to be identified for a project like this, so this slide here is I think our last slide, sort of the punchline in a way. So that Metra's project alone to rebuild all of these tracks around here and separate them so that the trains are no longer delaying one another when they have to cross each other's paths. That in and of itself is more than $1 billion type of a project. It's, as I mentioned, extraordinarily complicated, especially when you have an environment where all these trains need to continue passing through this area while the project is being built. That means it needs to be built in a lot of different stages, and that lengthens the time it takes to build it, and it adds a lot of complexity. But that's just a nature of doing infrastructure in an urban environment under traffic. And that obviously the A2 flyover project would then be built in a way that would accommodate the new station. And so there is a little more flexibility on the station side. Some of that $400 to $500 million, again, very early preliminary estimate of how much the station would cost. Some of that would have to be spent at the same time that the A2 flyover is getting built in order that the A2 flyover, would have the right foundations and supports and infrastructure in place to serve the station that would have to be built at the same time as the tracks are being built, because you really couldn't come in and do that later, or certainly be a lot more expensive to have to change things around after the new tracks are built. And then part of that, the station expense could be built either immediately after that or sometime after that. That's sort of like finishing the platforms, putting that's like a roof on the station, fitting out, finishing all of the stairs and elevators and those sorts of things like that. And it ideally would happen just straight away after that. But could, if the funding isn't all in place yet, that could follow on some amount of time after that. Again, very early numbers here. Subject to change as these concepts become more than just concepts and actually develop into plans. But for now, this is the ballpark that we're considering. So with that, okay, one more slide here. Yeah, just kind of talking about the next steps, which are kind of alluded to on that schedule slide. So as Metra mentioned, they are right now doing sort of what we call an early stage value engineering. Oftentimes value engineering comes also at the end of project design. Here we're still in very preliminary conceptual design, but also even at this stage, trying to figure out what are the most kind of cost-effective ways to do this track separation project. And then we need to understand where, what sorts of federal funding programs might be this might be eligible for, and what kinds of requirements they have, and how do we start lining up funding to do more detailed planning, environmental review, community engagement on making this project real, and understanding what it's all going to mean. And then that's all part of that NEPA process. And then likewise with the station, it's a very similar process. One opportunity we do have is to try to see if any sort of property comes up for sale along here, or there's any potentially willing sellers of land that might be needed for the station, or for, say, like the new Arbor Place extension, or other public infrastructure that might be needed. There could be what's called a protective land acquisition, so that city could be in a position to potentially buy some property now, and then that would help out later on to put in some of the surrounding infrastructure that's needed. But the primary thing that needs to be done, and over the upcoming next year or two, is identify basically the funding for how we would take these next steps, move this project into the formal environmental review and planning stages, and a public consultation that goes along with that. All right, so with that, I think we can move into Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff and David, for that very comprehensive presentation. So we will go through some of the questions that we received in advance of the meeting, and then we'll go to some of the Q&A that we are getting through the Q&A box. So first few questions, actually all of these questions that we got in advance of the meeting are for CDOT. Will there be station entrances on both North Ogden and North Ashland Avenues? I think you answered this in the presentation, but go ahead.
Yeah, correct. So the concept, this is just a concept at this point, but the idea is that by kind of leveraging the length of the platforms, we can serve both Ashland and Ogden, which the analysis showed was where the kind of the sweet spot for where the station should go from a travel demand perspective. And have entrances on both the east and west sides of Ashland, serving the north and southbound buses, and then the west side of Ogden. One thing I don't think I mentioned is that part of the concept is that obviously people would need to cross Ogden right now. There's not a crossing in between where those two railroad tracks are now. So this project would envision like a traffic signal controlled pedestrian crossing across Ogden to get to the other side. Not necessarily a bridge, because that presents a lot of challenges for accessibility, but with a signal-controlled large pedestrian crossing or crosswalk that could accommodate the people walking to and from the station to the east.
Okay. And there be track level walkways across the bridges so pedestrians and bus riders can access both sides of each road? If not, how can the project include streetscape improvements to make crossing the roads safer? This will be essential to help bus connections from both directions. The same question for elevators and ADA ramps. Yeah.
So I think these sort of streetscape questions and how the pedestrian environment is improved at the street level is going to be very, very important on all around the station, obviously in the immediate periphery of the station, but even extending out beyond it for blocks in each direction. And so I've been, apart from understanding that, yes, that is a very important thing to consider, we really, haven't done any planning or design related to that yet, but we know that would definitely need to be a part of the project as it's developed, is understanding where those improvements need to be made and why.
Okay, similar kind of line of questioning. What other streetscape improvements, such as reconstructed pedestrian walkways, ADA ramps, protected bike lanes, and crossings along streets like West Kinsey can be constructed or done in tandem with CDOT? What about landscape and greenery?
Yeah, so I think the same answer as I just gave, these would all be very ripe topics for discussion through the formal planning process to take this concept and turn it into something real. So those will all be areas that we would want to scope into trying to figure out.
Great. Any feasibility of mid-platform entrance with a tunnel to North Arbor and North Justine Street?
Yeah, so the illustration that we saw with the kind of circulation around there did show there would be multiple potential points of entry, access, and egress to the station area, as well as a kind of a concourse that would run the entire length under the tracks. So there would be essentially very permeable to get in and out of the station and go where you're going. The idea would be to not try to concentrate all the traffic in just one location, but to spread it out.
What about covered or indoor bike parking? Would be great to include that to help with last mile trips throughout the car congested West Loop.
Yeah, definitely those sorts of amenities, whether, there'd be many different types of typical amenities at transit stations that would be considered, when the project goes into more detailed design and planning. And that's certainly an amenity that we would want to take into account.
Great. Which Metra lines will stop here? It would be great to include the UP West line to this station. Is it possible that Amtrak can use this station as a Hiawatha stop? Again, helping regional commuters access this growing job center more easily.
So a station like this would be built so that any type of the train that would run on the tracks above could theoretically stop, but the exact determination of which trains would stop would be something that would be determined, based upon the service and demand conditions, later on. And obviously there would have to be some assumptions made, but that's, there's no, that we're not there yet.
Agree. Would also be great to have electronic display screens added to help commuters identify which train is approaching when, like what exists at Union or Ogden, and overall just generally needs plentiful and clear signage directing passengers to nearby amenities like bus stops and the CTA stations.
Yeah, so more great detailed design kind of ideas for station travel amenities. And I think the idea would be that we would, once the station is determined to be something that will actually be done, we want to make sure that it's designed to all of the most modern standards for how stations are built and what sorts of facilities they have, and wayfinding and signage and all of that.
Great. I think I'm going to hand it over to Jason, who's going to continue with the Q&A that we received during the meeting.
Hi, everyone. Let's see here. One of the questions is there a way to speed up the process? Just saying that that this is a needed project, and it would also help combat climate change and meet the Paris Climate Agreement.
Sure. I think a lot of times, major capital projects like this, the schedule is driven kind of two major parts. One is when is the funding available, and the other is how does the public process go to plan for and to design the station, and so both of those factors tend to take time. It takes time to identify funding to get the project started, and that's a relatively small amount of funding relative to the cost of the overall project. But once the process and the design gets started, there are a lot of public meetings. I'm sure there'll be a lot of public debate. This is just the very, very first of what will be many, many meetings over the years that, assuming that we, collectively decide this project should move forward. And that whole engagement process takes time, though, and there'll be a lot of refining done to designs over the years. And so while it'd be, great, especially if for, people are very eager to see this station happen, it'd be great to move very quickly, but we also have to be as, deliberative in line with the, the laws that govern how federal money is spent, particularly, and in respect to any impacts that this may have that are potentially not as favorable as what hopefully are some of the more favorable impacts that a station like this would have. We need to make sure that we're paying due attention to those and designing in a way that respects any negative impacts and tries to ameliorate those as best we can. And that it takes time.
I also want to make sure it was clear to everyone listening that, we can't build the station until the tracks are realigned. And that's the bigger, more costly, it's a much more involved project, just like any flyover project is. So, it's a different situation. If we could just build the station with the existing tracks, that would have a much shorter timeline, but we can't do that. We have to realign the tracks first, and then build the station or have them going at the same time. You can't just, so that's really the reason for the longer timeline.
Yeah, thanks for reiterating that. It's really a crucial point. But it also means that we need to have enough knowledge and enough planning and design of the station at the same time the tracks are being built, so that we know that we're putting the tracks exactly where they need to be in order to accommodate the future station. So it's a bit of an iterative process here that we'll be engaging on too. But that iteration also means that, it would take longer than just doing one or the other by themselves. But the end result will hopefully be much better.
Right. So the next question relates to facilitating transfer opportunities between Metra, CT, and PACE, specifically looking at additional service with more stopping patterns that I think would leverage the benefits that this station could bring.
Yeah, so I think that the station in and of itself doesn't, or at least shouldn't, impact train operations. It should, we should be sure to design the station in a way, that would allow the most flexible type of train operations in the future. That so because we don't know, what the demand patterns are going to be, and it could end up where, when the first day the station opens, certain trains stop there and others don't, and over time that changes. But we want to make sure when we, as detailed design happens, that it's being designed to handle, whatever, sort of future demand throws at it. Likewise, I think that's important at the ground level for circulation for buses, and for other forms of access, to make sure that, when and as this is designed, we're taking into account, the demand that CTA buses would need to serve this station, and where they may go and how they may operate in the future, which may be similar to today, may be different than today. What other types of access services are needed here? How to accommodate pickup and drop-offs, how to accommodate people walking and people bicycling comfortably and safely. So that'll all be factored into these design decisions, and we'll definitely be needing more public input on making sure that we're future-proofing this design as well as we can.
So the next question is about the taking of private property to accommodate the station, specifically the northwest corner of Kinsey and Ashland. Just looking for clarification. It looks like about pedestrian access, and the second question is, or is the pedestrian entrance south of Kinsey on Ashland?
And so again, this is a conceptual layout that we showed this evening. So things could change as more detailed design progresses in the upcoming years, and so it's really too early to say things very definitively now, but it's very likely that land will need to be acquired, or other arrangements will need to be made for property rights, depending upon the nature of the land that needs to be acquired. And there are processes for that to make sure that if land is acquired, that we follow what's called the Uniform Uniform Relocation and Assistance Act, which is the federal law that governs how public agencies use federal funding to purchase private property for public improvements. Those processes, can also take time, but that really all happens once the planning and design is complete. So they're the planning and preliminary design. So that's part of that environmental review process, is really understanding what is the sort of best configuration of the improvement and what would those impacts be on property nearby. And then once it's determined what is the most advantageous alignment for the project, and then it's understood what property will be needed, and then the negotiations would start to purchase the property only after all of that public process has gone on. So when I mentioned in there the concept of protective acquisition, that would be only in the case that there is a willing seller of land that's adjacent to where we think we may need land. Then it's possible to have a sort of friendly transaction between a willing seller and a willing buyer, where the city could potentially start, buying some property near here just to help out with that later on. But if there are no willing sellers, then we'll just let the design process play out, and then go through the standard process for purchasing land needed for infrastructure at the time that the design is complete.
All right, the next question is about station design and future compatibility with potential projects like Ashland BRT or potential Circle Line.
Yeah, so as noted, Ashland is a very major transit spine for the whole city. One thing I didn't note earlier, but people who are familiar with this area and have ever walked or driven through here could probably tell you right first thing is that Ashland narrows down as it goes under that existing viaduct. So that viaduct was built more than 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago, when Ashland was just a 66-foot wide street. And then I don't know the year that it happened, but it was in the early part of the last century that most of Ashland was widened to 100 feet, but the viaducts were never widened. So so now that this viaduct and some others along Ashland and Western is kind of the same situation in a number of places. The streets somewhat bottleneck as they go under the railroad tracks. Obviously, that's not very forward compatible for the type of bus transit service or potentially rail, subway or whatever in the future that might in the long term go along the Ashland corridor. So what we would want to do as part of this project is to make sure that the Ashland viaduct gets rebuilt to span the full 100-foot wide street that's there right now. And the sidewalks then would be very open, be more light filled, and wouldn't be as congested as it is now, have much longer spans across of the structure across the street. And the buses would be able to pull over against the curb under the viaduct without blocking through traffic. So that would all be kind of cleaned up as part of a big project like this, and it would be much more open and less congested under that viaduct than it is now.
Thanks, Jeff. Also typing some answers in at the same time. Let's see here. So the next question is about funding. Funding about how much money is in the Kinsey TIF and how much has been spent so far on the study, and how much is being budgeted going forward to continue evaluating this concept.
I don't know the numbers related to Kinsey TIF, but the study so far for the station, the city has spent about $500,000 on the feasibility analysis, and we wanted to definitely do the feasibility study before we did any more detailed study, because there was a chance that the feasibility study could come up as saying that, this is all fatal flawed no matter where we look, and we didn't want to, make a very, more commitments until we at least got sort of a baseline, knowing that technically the station could fit here, and now let's start working out the details. So I don't, yeah, the TIF in this area is a potential opportunity to do some of the advanced work like we've already started here, but it also depends upon how long the TIF lasts in this area.
It's expiring. Yeah, the Kinsey TIF is expiring at the end of next year. We've secured another $500,000 for continuing to study this, but that's for this study. That's all we've had so far.
That's it for now. And then Metra studies for A2, they're pursuing with other transit funding and on a parallel path.
Thanks, Jeff. All right. The next question is about, again, I think kind of future forward compatibility. This question is asking what other innovative design considerations are being made for first and last mile solutions such as bike share, scooter share, ride up, pick up, drop off, car sharing, and maybe even transportation devices that haven't been invented yet.
Sure. So I think, again, these are all the sorts of questions that we want to get into in a lot of detail once the formal preliminary engineering and environmental review start, to start, really determining at a fine grain sort of level, do we have space to accommodate, and where would that space be? I think at this conceptual level, all I can say is that the general notion that we want to make sure to have access on both sides of Ashland, because the obviously bus demand and the pedestrian demand along the sidewalks in Ashland, want to be able to have a front door, so to speak, on Ogden facing to the east, because there's clearly a lot of demand to the east. And then the area to the south of this station area, to take advantage of the interconnected grid of streets that's already there to the south, and to be able to have a sort of a continuous pickup and drop off zone on an extended arbor, at a conceptual level, what we've thought would be good ways to sort of build a strong foundation. Because what we found is that having multiple ways in and multiple ways out, and a network of streets that could connect here is in general a good way to future proof, because it doesn't concentrate demand, it spreads out demand, and if there happens to be a blockage or something, is congested at one area, there's multiple ways in and multiple ways out, so it doesn't get all gummed up. So I guess that, again, at a high conceptual level, this is what's guided our thinking. But as the detailed planning goes in the next few years, these ideas can be rethought, reassessed, embellished, hopefully improved upon. But this is kind of the starting point that we'll be working from, and then we'll see where this leads, and how much more we can improve from here.
All right. The next one is a question, I think, for Metra. The question is, has there been any study on alternatives to the A2 flyover in light of Metra taking over UP service?
So while we have not, the court ruling that's in reference is still being evaluated by Metra, the Metra team. And so we're not certain what the future will be in terms of Metra taking over UP service. But to the broader question, we have looked at other alternatives within this, as was mentioned in the study in the presentation previously. We did in our conceptual design work and feasibility analysis for A2, we did look at grade crossings, and we will continue to evaluate other options as we go forward with this. But we still feel at this point, based on the information we have, that the flyover provides the most future-proof solution. It provides the capacity that's needed for revenue and non-revenue service in the current situation, and also allows us to plan for proposed future expansions of service throughout through the A2 crossing and through this area.
Thanks, David. So the next question is refers to or asks about funding and the timeline. Asking if there's any way to speed up the timeline and how aggressive can all the agencies involved be in securing funding for the project.
Yeah, so I think, with a project of this nature, both the A2 project, which is, a huge project, and the Station 2, which is also very large, it's going to, require a substantial share or commitment of federal resources related to transit capital projects from a regional perspective. So so I think the first step is to make sure that, we can collectively identify the funds that are needed to continue planning for and preliminary design for the A2 project, resolve, some of the engineering questions for that and alignment questions, and then start the more formal planning and environmental review for the station itself too. And I think it's going to be, incumbent upon the city and Metra and our elected leaders throughout the region to determine, that this among a lot of priorities in the region, where does this fall and how do we allocate funding? So if this is a project that you like, I think the public support is going to be important to understand where the priorities are as well. But it just, like I said, it takes time to make those decisions, to have those deliberations, and then when it comes time to actually fund the construction too, that's a really big lift, and it is presumably going to need federal support, and federal support comes from Congress and infrastructure bills like the one we're hearing about. So if Congress is generous with infrastructure funding, that helps improve the prospects that this could be done sooner rather than later. But the first step is to do the planning and environmental review, because that's the foundation, and we're not even there yet. So that's kind of keep your eyes on that prize for the time being, I think is important.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, another question for Metra. Would Metra access to O'Hare Airport be provided from the proposed station? If so, could there be increased frequency to O'Hare? And what about Metra access to Midway Airport from the station?
So we are planning the station currently. The assumption is that North Central service trains, which currently extend to O'Hare Airport, would serve the station. The station is being planned. I alluded to the potential to expand service in the future. And so O'Hare is one of the markets that we're looking at serving better, connecting through the station. We have some existing work going on to study that in more detail. And as results of that become available, we'll have more to share going into the future. Oh, and in terms of Midway, there isn't a great path directly from this station to Midway Airport, but the idea, a lot of this area could be connected from the bus network to the Orange Line, which serves Midway, or from other rail lines connecting to the Orange Line to Midway downtown.
I just want to say that as this study continues to progress, even though obviously the city and Metra are very key to this all, CTA is and will continue to be the huge and very important stakeholder, particularly to ensure that what happens here does have good connectivity to all the other areas that are kind of beyond walking distance from this station. So that Ashland transit spine that exists now is that way because of CTA bus service. The CTA green and pink lines, which come near here and are within walking distance of this station area, could also be transfer connection opportunities. this project will continue to coordinate closely with the CTA to make sure that we're leveraging these opportunities to the greatest extent possible.
Right. The next question talks about land acquisition. The specific concern being that in the experience, it seems for Mary Bartlam Park, acquisition took a long time. And so parcels can lay vacant for a long time while the project is, before the project actually starts construction. So are there any considerations in regards to potential vacant lots with the station?
Well, there's no vacant lots right now near the station. What's near the station, are primarily used for surface parking, right, Jeff? So, I mean, I think our plan is if we were to acquire that property, we would still allow, for a time being anyway, for temporary use to be retained until such time that we need to start actual construction for any of this work.
Yeah, and I think we wouldn't know enough to know whether any structures, any like existing buildings would need to be built or acquired, or bought and or acquired to accommodate the station until we get further along in the design. That's sort of a big decision if you need to purchase a building or anything like that. So anything that we would sort of buy protectively would be related to some of the surface parking around here, just to make sure that it doesn't get built on. But we could also, the city, as developments occur, and we've done this in a lot of places where CDOT and the Department of Planning and Development and Metra and the CTA, for that matter, too, we all work together to try to figure out if new developments come in and should they be set back a certain distance from a potential future transportation facility, just to make sure there's enough room to fit that in. Even if we don't know exactly how much space it's going to take, we could probably say, well, if you set it back 10 or 20 feet from there, that may be enough, or whatever that dimension would need to be. So those sorts of things, I think we could also, work with if there are future developments planned around here, make sure that they're not too close that they might get in the way in the future.
Since we're on this topic of acquisition, there's a question further down in the list about who's going to be the lead in acquiring, if it's going to be Metra or CDOT or the city. So I don't know if Jeff, if you want to respond,
I think
we're on this topic.
Yeah, in general, if there's an opportunity to do a protective acquisition or just a friendly, sale of property with a willing seller and a willing buyer, that buyer would most likely be the city at this stage. Because the city has the ability to purchase property for economic development purposes and in that way, and that would be the way to do it. When it comes time where the project is actually designed and has completed the environmental review, and we have the authority to engage in transactions that way, then that could be Metra, or it could be the city, just depending upon the nature and use of the property in question and what it would be needed for. So I think it kind of depends upon the stage of the project as to who would be likely purchasers.
All right, thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Jeff. So the next question, specifically about North Ada Street, the 400 block of North Ada Street, just north of the proposed station, closer to the Ogden entrance. Question is, what safety, security, and traffic accommodations will be made for the residents that live there? And a specific question about what does it mean to vacate or block off Ada Street? Looking for clarification there.
So the sort of detailed block by block impacts on streets around here is definitely something that the the detailed design and planning and environmental review would take into account and assess what would, what could the impacts be, or what should the impacts be on kind of a block by block basis surrounding the station. So the Ada Street impacts near Ogden would definitely be part of that. So at this point, there's no definitive understanding of what and how Ada should be impacted. Just from a very conceptual perspective, if the station were to be built and have an entrance that faced Ogden there, that sort of skew intersection with Ada, which is right now very low traffic, would all of a sudden see a lot more pedestrian activity. And so it might make sense to say, like, cul-de-sac Ada north of the railroad, and then turn that area where the intersection with Ogden is now into more of a pedestrian plaza and entryway. But exactly how that would be designed and how to, to make sure that all the adjacent properties have the access that they need, and to make sure that there's not sort of unwanted traffic coming through there, are all sort of design considerations that, seem very likely that they would arise, but we would we're way too early to sort of get into figuring that out quite yet. That would all come as part of the formal design and a lot of consultation with the neighbors around there on that block, but as well as any other blocks around that where there are localized issues, and want to make sure that the design respects both what's happening now, but what could also happen in the future on any of these blocks.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, so switching back over to the alternatives analysis for the A2 flyover. The question is, did that indicate that it would speed up, or there was an indication that A2 would speed up service, but with this new station, is that still relevant, or do the findings from that study need to be updated in relation to the station we're talking about here tonight?
So the alternative, or the analysis that was previously done, did indicate, and I think this question also asked about the potential to stop fewer trains at Western Avenue. So the final determination of which trains would stop at which station is far from settled, and so we would need to explore that as service plans are developed in light of the new infrastructure. But the broader question is, if trains are able to speed up through here, some trains would be able to speed up. Some trains that would, and that accounts for some of the capacity increase. And then some trains would be able to speed up and also stop at this new station, which would and then be able to use some of that capacity that's created for the station. So there's a give and take between that, and we'll still work to determine what the final and what the ultimate stopping pattern will be for trains moving through the station. But as Jeff mentioned, the station is really designed to be flexible and to be able to accommodate a whole host of different service patterns, a whole host of different lines, and to retain as much future flexibility as we can.
Thanks, David. So let's see here. Another Metra question. So this is a community concern. During rush hour, certain Metra trains sit on the tracks near Ada and Ogden. The question is, will the track realignment and flyover eliminate the need for Metra trains to stop near here and idle during rush hour?
So some of those trains that are paused there are waiting to get into the yard. Some of them are waiting to go into the terminal, and others are waiting to just get across A2. So some of those trains will be impacted, and some of those movements will be able to be more free flowing with an A2 flyover. We can't guarantee that there will be no stoppage of trains, because we still do have trains that may need to slow down to get into the yard, and may need to stage to get in to serve the evening rush hour. But this flyover project will definitely improve the ability of trains to move more freely throughout this area. And so we anticipate that there will be less of the circumstance that's described in this question.
Thanks, David. And Cindy, I see you've selected a question to answer live.
Oh yeah, there was someone, I was also going to type an answer too. Someone was asking how they stay informed about this, if they wanted to provide comments after this meeting or wanted to make sure they received e-blasts about future meetings. So we do have a section on our webpage, www.chicago/gov.gov/West Loop. And I was going to put the link in the typing when I answered him, but that way there's a section on the right side of that webpage where you can sign up for e-blasts. And so for future meetings, that will be distributed then to any emails that sign up for that.
Yeah, Cindy, I'll go ahead and drop that the direct link to the email sign up page in the chat right now.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, and then when I moved the presentation, I couldn't get back to the answer box, so I'm not sure what my screen's showing right now. All right, the next question is, are there any renderings of the proposed station?
So it's really kind of too early to have meaningful renderings of the station. I mean, you could, but it would imply sort of a level of design and just definitiveness about how things are going to perform that's really not accurate at this point, because we really haven't started formal design. It's just very, again, conceptual feasibility, like it's something feasible. So just because, we could show a rendering of something that's feasible does not mean that that's actually what would be built. And we just don't want to provide misleading information and make it seem like decisions have been made that really haven't been made yet. I think, it's fun to look at renderings and imagine, but we're really not far enough along yet to really be able to do that. But hopefully when we identify funding to get the environmental process and the preliminary engineering started, then there will definitely be renderings coming out of that. First kind of starting with massing to figure out, what these elements are going to look like and about how much space they're going to take, and then getting, obviously more into the details of exactly what kind of materials might be used and all of that kind of fun stuff. It all would all come in due time.
All right. Let's see here. A couple questions on funding and then kind of ownership. I'll kind of group them together. So one of the questions is, shouldn't all of this project be federally funded, including the feasibility study? And somewhat related question is, who would own and operate the station?
So the federal funding comes with a lot of constraints, I guess you should say. So we have to be very careful when we decide to use federal funding on projects, especially at a very early stage where we're just trying to get concepts, trying to figure out feasibility and do things like this. Sometimes federal funding is not the most appropriate to be used at that stage in a project. It requires it has a lot of reporting requirements, a lot of administrative requirements on that. And so that's where kind of TIF was, why we use TIF to get this started, is that it's the administrative burden on using TIF and being able to study and be flexible about what sort of alternatives are come up with was far more efficient use of resources at this stage. And relative to the overall dollar amounts we'd be talking about for this, there'll be plenty of opportunity for large federal contributions going forward. But once the project is into greater stage of design, then that's when federal funds, I think, would become a more efficient type of funding resource. Sorry, I've forgotten the second half of that question.
Who would own and operate this?
Oh, own and operate. So it's a good question. And to which there is really not an answer right now. There's right now there's multiple owners of the railroad tracks that go through here too. It's not just Metra, but Union Pacific owns some of the property that's going through here. The Norfolk Southern Railroad, even though they don't operate passenger trains, they still own some of the land that's involved here, and also have rights to run trains through here too. And so I think that, between Metra and the other railroads that have property interest in here, and obviously the city of Chicago, there'll have to be, over time, we'll figure out some sort of, agreements as to, who will have what property rights and how they will be acquired and come about. But it's far too early to just, to say anything other than there's a lot of potential options here, and we'll just have to work through it.
And Jeff, for the federal funding question, isn't it also true that a lot of federal funding comes with the caveat that there needs to be some sort of local funding for a portion of a lot of these infrastructure and transit projects?
True, exactly, yeah. So that could vary, anywhere from like 50 to the other way around, 20 to 50% are local, or 50 to 80% federal, just depending upon the type of federal funding source. Recently the feds and Congress, who passes the laws that govern this federal funding, have been keen on a higher non-federal share, so more towards the 50% and less towards the 20%. But generally, it falls somewhere in that range. So there will always have to be a non-federal share, so that means that there's a high likelihood that there will have to be state and or other local resources that would be put into this as well, which is very typical for other major transit projects. If you look at other major transit projects that Metra has done or that CTA has done, that's typical of the type of funding mix that goes in.
And I would just add one piece to that generally the federal funds that Jeff is referencing are mostly available once you've gotten further into design for this. And so for further design or for construction, that federal funds, the federal government generally wants local entities to take the first step in initiating, be it conceptual design, be it station feasibility studies, so that they can demonstrate that there's some local skin in the game, so to speak, or some local interest. And so the funding, those large scale funding programs are generally available once you've better defined what the project is, what the benefits are coming out of that. And that's really what this study on the station feasibility side, and what some of the work that Metra's explored on the A2 flyover side have really been in support of.
Great, thanks. I think we're at the end of the Q&A. We answered 50 questions, both either live or writing, so that's great. Thank you, everyone on the panel. Alderman Burnett, do you want to say some closing remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, everyone on the panel. Thank everybody for their patience. I pray that all of us are able to be around and see what happens with this. It's a long process, but it's something that we have to do in order to make transportation better. I think that if we were to get something like this, it would enhance the values of properties in this community. It would enhance the values of businesses moving to this area. It'll have a major impact, not only on this community, but on the city. Being involved with the Central Area Plan years ago, they were looking for transportation hubs like this further east. They never in their wildest dreams would have thought that it would be needed further west. So our community has come a long way. And, it just excites me to see how much further we're going to go as time goes on. So we're a blessed area, a blessed community. And I pray that we are able to do these things without hurting people, that it becomes a win-win situation for everyone. So I just want to thank everyone for being involved. Thank Metra, thank transportation, thank planning. Also, we want to thank the governor's office and the mayor's office for being involved with this also. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
I'd also like to thank the alderman for his support in making sure that we're respecting the voices of the community and getting the word out. So this is a team effort. We really appreciate the alderman's support with this.